With that, thank you all for joining us for this seminar, which is part of Academic April. Academic April is a series of seminars that we are doing through the Career Development Office, which are all focused around academic careers and sort of figuring out your path through academia. The topic of today's seminar is a PhD right for you? So possibilities, paths, and preparation. My name is Hannah Hathaway. I am the program manager of the Career Development Office here at CU Anschutz. So I mentioned we would start with a couple mentee questions. So once again, if you're not in there yet, the directions are in the chat. But our first question here on the mentee is going to be, what is your current position? So right now, which of these would best describe you? Yeah, from the registration, that's pretty much what I was seeing. So it looks like we are mostly master's students and research service professionals or PRAs, with at least one other. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance to explain what your other is, whoever the other is. I will mention that in registration, I noticed a couple PhD students registered for this seminar, and that's great. We're happy to have you. The purpose of this seminar is more to determine if starting a PhD program and like pursuing a PhD is the right choice for you. So if you are a PhD student currently and you're maybe grappling with, is staying in your PhD program the right choice for you, then I think today still will be helpful. But if that's a question you have, you might want to instead just make an appointment with the Career Development Office, and we can talk to you about that one-on-one and kind of help you weigh your pros and cons for your specific situation. Okay, so let's do our next question here. At this point in time, how strongly are you considering pursuing a PhD? You can like drag that little slider where 1 all the way to the left is not at all, and 5 is very strongly. Oh man, someone was like, yes, I got it. All the way 5. We love to see it. Oh, okay, it's changing. It's changing. Okay, okay. We got a couple, quite a few 5s, maybe some, looks like some 2s maybe, and some more like in between. But for the most part, it looks like of the people who have answered so far that we are leaning towards thinking about a PhD, which I think considering that you're on an academic campus, that probably makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's do our last question here. What are you hoping to learn in today's seminar? You are limited to only, I think, 200 characters, so keep it brief here. What are you hoping to learn? The application process, we're definitely going to talk about that a little bit towards the end. What to expect when applying and tips, yep, we're going to talk about that. Process of applying, what to emphasize in grad school applications, definitely what to look for in PhD programs, how to find a good fit, pros and cons. Awesome. So we're going to talk about all of those things. I would say if you are, job outlook, that's a good one. Main difference between a PhD and master's with experience, that's a great question. Role of PhD and career path, we're going to kind of touch on all of these things. So hopefully you will leave today getting a lot of your questions answered. Since a lot of you are wondering about the application process and making sure you are a strong applicant for PhD programs, that is something that we can also help you with in the Career Development Office when you are preparing like your CV and your resume, your personal statements, things like that. If you want someone to take a look at that, we are happy to provide feedback on that for you as you're applying to programs. Yeah. Okay, that was our last little question there. Oh, let me go to the next slide. There you go, the Career Development Office. That's right. Okay. So our learning objectives for the seminar today, a lot of the things you guys already said you wanted to learn about. So starting off with just like the basics of what is a PhD program. Then we're going to compare and contrast some of the pros and cons of deciding to pursue a PhD. We're going to talk about some tools and resources to help you explore different careers in science. That's going to be really important to help you understand if a PhD is aligned with your career goals. Then we're also going to talk about alternatives to a PhD to figure out, do you really need a PhD to get to where you want to go, or are there other paths that you could take? And then finally, we will talk about those key components of a PhD application and what you can do to set yourself up to have a successful application. And then, as I mentioned, as you're going through this process, the Career Development Office is here to help you. You can find us just by honestly Googling CU Anschutz Career Development. You'll find us. Or I send emails all the time. Obviously, you must have gotten them because you signed up for this seminar. One of the things we offer are one-on-one career coaching. So you can schedule that through Handshake. If you are a current master's student, if you are a research service professional or a PRA, you can just email me and I'll send you the secret link for you to sign up for career coaching. We also have workshops all the time about things like career exploration and resume writing. All of those things will be helpful as you are considering furthering your graduate education. Okay, so just a little bit about me. Like I said, my name's Hannah. I'm the program manager at the Career Development Office, but what was I doing before that? So I got my bachelor's degree at CU Boulder in biochemistry and molecular biology. And I chose those topics because I knew pretty much when I was in high school that I wanted to pursue research. I was never like pre-med or anything like that. It was always research for me. I just really liked exploring scientific questions. And I loved learning about how cells work and how the body works and how you can use that knowledge to make people better and like treat disease. That's what I wanted to do. So while I was an undergrad, I did some research actually here at CU Anschutz, and then I actually worked as a PRA for a year at CU Anschutz, and that really cemented for me that I loved research and that I wanted to do a PhD. So then I went and got my PhD in pharmacology from Georgetown University. The reason that I chose pharmacology is because, like I mentioned, I really liked knowing how cells work and understanding how, or using an understanding of how when things go wrong, we can target those problems and then use that knowledge to design medications. So I was really interested in drug discovery and drug development. And so pharmacology is essentially how do drugs interact with the body and how does the body interact with drugs? So that obviously made a lot of sense for my career goals, which is why I picked a PhD in pharmacology. Why I picked Georgetown University is because I applied to a number of different programs throughout the country, including CU Anschutz. But I had a partner who had just gotten a job in Washington, D.C., and so I decided to move to Washington, D.C. to be close to my partner. And of the schools I applied to, that was the best fit in terms of program and the interest that I had. So that's why I chose Georgetown. And then after my PhD, I did a postdoc. This is pretty common for a lot of people. After you do your PhD, you continue your training as a postdoc, which is sort of analogous to like a medical resident. So even though you have that PhD, you undergo additional training. It's not necessarily a degree. It's just more training to become more of an independent scientist. I did that here at CU Anschutz in cell and developmental biology. When I was a postdoc, I really discovered that I had fallen in love with teaching. And so after my postdoc, I taught for a number of years. I taught high school. I still teach at a nursing school on the side. And then I also have a bit of an educational role here now at CU Anschutz in the Career Development Office. So I lead seminars and workshops like this one, and I help early career scientists like you figure out what they want to do in their career and help them navigate their career path. So I wanted to go through my background a little bit just so that you all understand that I have been where you have been. I have, at one point in my life, decided if I wanted to pursue that PhD or not. I have weighed different options of which program was the right fit for me. And so I truly understand sort of the process you are going through. And then plus it's my job to help you navigate these things. So I hope that I can provide some advice and some insights on this process today. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Just what is a PhD and why would you want to get one? And I will mention that as we are going, if you have questions at any time, you are more than welcome to just drop those in the chat, or you can always like raise your hand on Zoom and I'll call on you. Ooh, and actually that reminded me. People always ask, will there be slides? Can I have the slides? Yes, you can have the slides. If you want them right now, I just dropped a link there in the chat, but I will also share those with you when we're done today. Okay, so let's start with just what is a PhD or a Doctor of Philosophy? So this is a terminal degree, meaning it is the highest degree awarded within the sciences. After you get a PhD, that's it, that you've reached the pinnacle of school for sciences. what makes a PhD sort of different than other educational experiences is you really have an emphasis on, of course, like deep content knowledge, but also critical thinking, and then trying to become an independent scientist. So it's going to be a lot of figuring out how to ask good scientific questions and then how to design experiments to appropriately answer those questions. One thing that is sort of different about a PhD compared to other educational experiences is there's no set timeline. In the United States, a PhD is going to run you somewhere around 4 to 6 years on average. 4 is definitely on the short end. I would say 6 is probably more what most people do. I know for me, it took just a little over 5.5 years to complete my PhD. What are you doing during that time as a PhD student? You are doing some coursework, but most of the time you are doing full-time research. So I like to think that in other educational experiences, so in like undergrad and a master's degree, those programs are really teaching you what to know. But in a PhD, instead, it's teaching you how to think. And that's pretty hard. It's hard to teach you how to think. And that's why it takes so long. And that's also why the timeline is variable, because it's going to be different for every person. So with that in mind, kind of on the same vein, what makes PhD grad school, like the actual PhD schooling itself, different than a master's degree or undergrad? I know for me, a PhD felt very different than undergrad did. So like I mentioned, a PhD teaches you how to think. And that's a very different experience because there's not necessarily like one right answer. It's more about learning a process, and that just feels very different. So if you were the type of student, or you are the type of student now where you know, really put your nose to the grindstone, you study a lot, you get good grades, you are used to working hard and then having that pay off by getting A's in your classes, that grad school for a PhD can feel really different because that is not always going to lead to success in research and in a PhD. You can work really hard and things just might not work out the way you thought they did. That could be because maybe it turns out your hypothesis was wrong, so you generated negative data. Or it could be because of things outside of your control, like technical problems. Or for example, for me, when I was a postdoc, I spent about 6 months breeding a mouse line to do a series of experiments on. And then after those 6 months, we figured out eventually that the genotype I was breeding was actually embryonic lethal. So I, one, couldn't do those experiments because all the mice were dead. But two, I essentially had nothing to show after that 6 months of work. So even though I worked very hard to breed those mice, I essentially got nothing to show for it on paper. And that could be a really frustrating experience, especially when you first start your PhD. If you were the kind of student who was like really nose to the grindstone, you work really hard, you're used to succeeding, that can be a bit of a tough transition when you start your PhD. So good to keep that in mind. And then, of course, one thing that makes a PhD different than other types of school is you get paid when you are a PhD student, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that means that PhD is school and also a job at the same time. So that's a very unique experience, going to school and getting paid to go to school at the same time and like working full time as a working student. So that also just leads to a unique experience that you probably haven't had before. So what does a typical PhD program look like? Like I mentioned, somewhere around 4 to 6 years. So this is a rough timeline. It'll be variable for each program. In general, coursework, so like actually going and taking classes, that's going to be a year or two, depending on your program. Here at CU Anschutz, I would say most programs only have a year of coursework. For my PhD, we had 2 years of coursework, but the second year you only took one class. So it was pretty much just 1 year. But once again, it's different for each program. At the end of your coursework, oftentimes you will take a really big exam, like a final exam, which is called a qualifying exam or quals. Sometimes they're called prelims or preliminary exams. It's essentially a final exam for everything that you have learned in your coursework. The format of that exam is going to be different for different programs. For some programs, it will be open note and you'll have some questions you have to answer, like write an essay for over a couple of days. For other programs, it might look like a final exam in a course where you sit down and you have like 2 hours to write some exams all in one room together. That's what mine was more like. Just depends on the program and on the school. In addition, in those first 2 years, in your first year, you will do rotations. So rotations in a PhD program, you are essentially like mini research projects. Usually you do 3, and they will last, maybe about 3 months. And it's essentially a way to try out different labs before you pick a lab for your PhD program or for your PhD research. So that's really nice because it means when you start your PhD, you don't have to know right away which lab you're going to join. You have a chance to try out the different labs because, of course, you can look up the research the labs are doing before you start the program, but you're not going to have a good idea of like how well you mesh with the other people in the lab, if the advisor or the PI in that lab as it has a good mentorship style that suits you well. Those are all the things that you figure out during your rotations. So rotations are a really important part of that first year. If you are thinking about a PhD program, really spend a lot of time upfront thinking about the rotations you want to try. Talk to senior PhD students about the different professors in the program, and just if they've heard like, yes, this is a really great mentor, or this person might be harder to get advice from and they're really busy, so sometimes it's hard to be a student in their lab. Get advice from other people. Also look at things like how much funding those labs have, because a lab that has more funding is just going to mean less worries that you will have during your PhD. So after those rotations, so usually, do most programs have rotations? That was a question in the chat. Yes, I am not aware of any science PhD programs that do not have rotations. That's a pretty standard process. Sometimes you might only do one rotation. So maybe you come in, you do a single rotation, and you're like, this is it. I love it. This is the lab I wanted to join. I did my rotation. I want to stay. Some programs will let you do that. Other programs might be like, no, you still have to try out 3. That's a program specific question, but generally that process is pretty standard across the board. So at the end of your rotations, then you usually will join a lab. At that point, it's just sort of like a agreement between you and the lab that you're going to do your research within that lab for your PhD program. Then at the next step, so after years 1 and 2, or 1 to 2, depending on the program, you will then become a full-time researcher. So now you're done with classes. This is the part of a PhD that really looks like a job. So if you are a research service professional or a PRA right now, and you're working 40 hours a week in your lab, PhD students who are in this part of the program are also working 40 hours or more a week in lab. So it's going to look from the outside like very similar. Within that time, when you are in the full-time research phase, there are some exams you get to take as well. So the exam you usually take at this point is something called a comprehensive exam, or COMPS. Once again, this is variable depending on the program, but usually I'd say it's about 6 months into this full-time research phase. And usually after this point, you become something called a PhD candidate, essentially meaning you have done all of the coursework and all of that type of stuff for your PhD program. And all you have left to do is your dissertation and your research. So it's sort of like you've done sort of the class-based requirements, and you're just working on that full-time research. I will mention that title, PhD candidate, variable from program to program, deciding like on when they call you a PhD candidate. It's not a big deal, it's just terminology. So what does that comprehensive exam look like? At most schools, it's usually a grant proposal, and you're essentially outlining what you want to do during your PhD research. So that's why usually it's 6 months or so after you join that lab, so you have time to think about what you're going to do, talk with your mentor, talk with your PI. What is my program going to look like? What is my research going to look like? You write it up as a mock grant proposal, and then you submit it to a committee of faculty members who read it, and then they grill you on it and ask you a bunch of questions. And if you do well on all the questions, and they say, congratulations, you passed, and then you officially become a PhD candidate, and then you're just doing research for the next couple of years. And then at some point, you will continue to check in with that committee of faculty members on your progress. Usually once a year, you have a check-in meeting, and they talk about what you have accomplished. And at some point, they will decide you have accomplished enough, and you are ready to start writing your dissertation. So at that point, you write up your dissertation, which is a very, very long written report of all your research. It's usually well over 100 pages. Usually at this point, or at this time during your full-time research, you'll be publishing at least one paper. So oftentimes your dissertation will include that paper as a chapter, is how we would describe that. So that is a at the end here of your research, you'll be writing that dissertation, and then sort of the last exam you have is your dissertation defense, where usually you give a presentation to the public. It's usually your department and like your family comes. It's really fun. You talk about all your research, and then you get grilled by that committee of faculty members again. And then if you do well, they say, congratulations, you've passed, and then now you have a PhD. So that is what the typical PhD program looks like. Like I said, variable how long it takes, somewhere around 4 to 6 years for most people. Does a doctorate degree look similar to the PhD? So by doctor, do you mean a medical doctor? So if it's a medical doctor, no, that is very different. What do you mean by doctor? So PhD is technically a doctor, your doctorate. Doctor PH, like a doctor of philosophy?
Well,
That is a
there's
PhD.
in the public health department, there's a DRPH degree.
Oh, of
And
public
there's
health.
also
Thank
a
you. Thank you.
PhD degree. And I
Um,
wonder, yeah.
that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with what a doctorate of public health looks like and how that is different from a PhD. That would be a good question to ask the Public Health Career Services Office. Generally, you will still have a research component, but usually those degrees, I believe, are shorter than a PhD program.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So just so everyone knows, how do you pay for PhD programs? I think it's important to think about this before you hop into graduate school, which can take 4 to 6 years, right? That's a lot more school. So how do you pay for it? Well, it turns out most PhD programs in the United States are fully funded in sciences. I should mention, if you're thinking about a PhD in like humanities, might be different, but in sciences, they are usually fully funded, which means you don't have to pay anything. So you should not have to take on any student loans to get a PhD in the United States. In other words, the school will pay your tuition. You do not have to take on any additional debt, which is really great news, right? Who doesn't want to go to school for free? In fact, most PhD students receive a stipend and health insurance as part of their program. So in addition to getting your education fully funded, you are actually paid, and you also get health insurance. A stipend is the money that you receive while you are a PhD student. Your stipend can be funded in different ways depending on your program. Some programs require you to have a TA responsibility, so you have to teach undergrads in some capacity. Whereas other programs, you are only doing research, so you're just full-time doing research. That timeline I showed you before, there wasn't really any TA activity within there. If you're in a program that requires TA activity, usually that would be in years like 3 through 6. You would also, in addition to doing research, have some amount of your time that would be working as a TA and teaching. Just so you know, the average PhD stipend in the United States is somewhere around $40,000 to $50,000 a year. It's going to be variable depending on the school. Usually schools that are in cities with higher cost of living are going to pay more because it's more expensive to live there in general. So it's not a bad thing to look up as you're thinking about schools, like what is the stipend, and look up the cost of living of that city and just try to figure out like, okay, is that enough? Am I going to be able to live on that? So it's definitely, $40,000 to $50,000 a year is not anything, that's not bad, right? It's better than working at McDonald's or something like that, but it's also less than you would probably make working in industry or something like that. So these are all things to consider as you are thinking about your potentially joining a PhD program. A good thing to keep in mind too is that at most schools, as far as I know, that PhD stipend doesn't change as you are going through grad school. So if your stipend, for example, at CU Anschutz is $41,910 a year, and you come in at year 1, that's what you would get paid. When you leave at year 6, you're going to get paid about the same thing. There might be some like cost of living adjustments, like maybe 1% or 2%, but you don't get like a raise at any point. So just good things to keep in mind as you are considering a PhD program. Okay, so why do it? What kind of jobs become available with a PhD? What doors does it open? So there are definitely a number of jobs that you absolutely need a PhD for. Here within academia, of course, one of the big ones would be faculty. So if you want to be a PI, if you want to run your own lab, that's pretty much you must have a PhD in order to do that. There are other jobs within academia besides being a faculty member that also could require a PhD. For example, if you wanted to run a core facility. So at CU Anschutz, we have a number of core facilities. For example, there is one that has to do with like genomics. So different research labs can bring samples to that core facility, and they will do genomics and analysis on those samples, and then give that data back to those research labs. So they're almost like contractors, but they're within the university. Oftentimes, the people that run those core facilities are PhD scientists because they need to have deep contact knowledge, expertise within those techniques, and they need to be able to help those labs like really troubleshoot and analyze that data. So that's a great option if you're like, man, I really love this specific technique and I just want to be the expert on this one specific like method. Core facilities could be a great place for you to end up. And if that's what you're interested in, a PhD is definitely something you can consider. In addition, if you are wanting to teach in higher ed, so at universities, at community colleges, oftentimes you need a PhD to do that. Sometimes if you want to teach at community colleges, you can do that with a master's, but I would say it is harder to get those positions without a PhD. Government research, so if you wanted to do research at the NIH or the CDC and run a research lab there, you're going to need a PhD to run a lab there, just like you would need a PhD to run a lab in academia. In addition, there's a lot of other jobs within government that are related to research, but not bench research. So for example, at the NIH, the program officers, those are the people who help review grants that are submitted by scientists. And they like review the grants and help make the study sections, which are the scientists who are actually like reading the grants and scoring them. Oftentimes those people have PhDs because they need deep subject matter expertise in order to do those positions. And then of course you could also do research in industry. So at a biotech company or a pharmaceutical company, especially if you're interested in leadership positions. I will mention that you absolutely can do research in industry with a master's degree or even with a bachelor's degree. In that case, you could use years of experience in industry as sort of a substitute for a PhD. But if you really want to be in a leadership position within research, so you want to be like the director of, or like the science director of the R&D program at a big pharmaceutical company, that person almost certainly is going to have a PhD. So if that's what you want, you like want to be the top dog in the R&D department, then a PhD is a good choice for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. But if you are interested in industry, but maybe are even interested in leadership positions, but not on the R&D side, maybe you want to be more on like the business side or more on like a patient-centered like clinical operation side. For those types of things, there might be other paths that could get you into those leadership positions that are not necessarily a PhD. And then in addition, there's other roles within industry, so within private companies where a PhD is helpful. For example, one of them is medical science liaison. Those are people who work at pharmaceutical companies or like medical device companies and talk with clinicians about how to use their products, like how to use different drugs for their patients. So they're kind of educating physicians on current research related to those products, those like devices or those pharmaceuticals. A terminal degree is usually required for that. It could be a PhD, a PharmD, could be an MD. Regulatory affairs, so those are people who are involved with like kind of clinical trials space and also like submitting applications to the FDA. Oftentimes a PhD can help you get into those fields. It's not the only way to get into those fields, but they can help you get in there. And then also consulting. If you really want to get into consulting, you can get in there without a PhD, but it is something that might help you be more competitive for those types of positions. So just a smattering of some of the types of jobs that become available if you have a PhD. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about some good and bad reasons to get a PhD. So some good reasons, in my opinion, to get a PhD would be you are curious about a specific question. So maybe there is a specific scientific topic that you are passionate about, and you really want to explore that topic. That's a good reason to get a PhD. Another good reason is you have worked in a lab before. So if you're a research service professional right now, you're working in a lab and you're like, I actually really like this. I want to keep doing it. That's a good reason to get a PhD. Of course, if you're interested in a career that requires a PhD, for example, if you want to be a faculty member, then you're going to need a PhD. Similarly, if you want to be a leader in your career, so like if you want to be at the top of that R&D department, a PhD is one of the ways to get you up there. It's going to help. Or in other words, if you like directing and kind of being in charge, when you are in your PhD training and learning how to become an independent scientist, you will be in charge of your own project. So if you like being in charge, then a PhD could be a good fit for you. Similarly, if you want to be the person who is coming up with the questions, so you're actually figuring out the questions that we want to answer and then figuring out how to answer those questions, like how to design experiments to answer those questions, those are all good reasons to get a PhD. Okay, so what are some bad reasons to get a PhD? I said less good reasons to get a PhD. You don't want a real job yet. That's not a good reason to get a PhD. You just love being a student and you want to be a student forever. That's not a great reason to get a PhD. Like I mentioned before, being a PhD student feels really different than being a student in other educational programs. So if you just love being a student, you might be unhappy in a PhD because it's going to feel so different than your other student experiences. So don't get a PhD just because you love being a student. Similarly, you just can't find a real job. So you're like, I haven't been able to find anything. I'll get a PhD. A PhD takes 4 to 6 years. You will find a job within 4 to 6 years if you keep looking. So if you just can't find a real job, just keep looking. Don't decide you need to get a PhD. You're bored and you just don't know what else to do. Not a great reason to get a PhD. You just want people to call you doctor. I mean, it's cool, but then some people won't call you doctor because they'll be like, you're not a medical doctor. It's fine, whatever. And then the last one is money. I put 2 asterisks here because I want to talk about like the pros and cons of getting a PhD in terms of salary. So let's explore that a little bit more. So just to say this up front, since my main job is working at the career development office, I want to remind you that money itself is not a great motivator for career satisfaction. If your number one motivator is just to make money, there are a lot of careers that you could make a lot more money in than science. So if that's your primary motivation, I think it's just going to be challenging because you could make a lot more money other places. So keeping that in mind, what are some of the pros and cons from a salary standpoint of a PhD? So of course, like I mentioned before, no student loans when you get a PhD, right? So you're not taking on any additional debt. That's fantastic. You're getting paid during your PhD. So nothing's getting like taken in the negative while you're getting that PhD. That being said, while you are in that PhD program, you're at that somewhere like $50,000 a year range, and you're going to stay there for 4 to 6 years. If you went and got a job with your master's degree in industry, 1, you're probably going to be making more than $50,000 a year. 2, you'll probably get raises throughout that time. So over those 5 years, you would make more money than you would during your PhD program. That's just true. But the flip side, when you graduate with your PhD and then you enter the job market, as a PhD, you will make, in theory, more money than someone who has a master's degree. So in other words, over the course of your life, someone with a PhD should make more money. So I think this is most apparent in these 2 here. So this is master's in orange and then PhD in purple. So people who are, 25 to 34, which I'm guessing is probably where most of you guys are, there's not a huge difference here between master's and PhD. But then when you get to the next 10 years, 35 to 44, so now these are people who have been out of their PhD program for a longer period of time. You can see now that gap starts to become a lot different, and the PhDs have really jumped up a lot, whereas the masters didn't really see much of a jump. So over time, you likely will make more money if you have a PhD, but it will take you years to get there. So that is an important consideration because this is just like a personal preference and something you should know about yourself. If you feel like, I've been working for a while, I'm making around $50,000 now, I want to make more, I want to buy a house, like I'm ready to move on to the next phase of my life, and you're about to start your PhD program and know you have another 5 years of sitting at $50,000, it is up to you if you're okay with that, knowing that 5 years from now, you might make more money than you would have otherwise. So that's a personal question. But it's just something to consider. If you're ready for that big pay bump now, then maybe a PhD is not the right choice. But if you're okay with the delayed gratification of getting a higher earning potential in the future, then maybe a PhD is a good choice. There was a question from Lisa. Lisa, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm an encore student, so I'm at the high end. Why are the salaries dropping off? Is it because you can't get the salary anymore?
Do you
When
mean
you get
on this
over
graph?
65, they won't pay you? Or,
Um,
because I know a lot of professors that are really up there in years and are
my guess would
choosing
be some of
to
these people
go.
are not working full time anymore, would be
Oh,
my
okay,
guess
that would
here.
make
Because
sense. Okay.
these are people who are usually past retirement age. So that would be my guess is why this drops off across all sectors or all
Okay. So they're
ages.
probably still paying, if you looked at it by the hour, the same amount. It's just people aren't working as much.
That would be
They
my
might cut
guess. Yeah,
back to halftime or something.
right.
Okay.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question. Okay. So, um, to end sort of our what is a PhD and why you get one, just some like real talk for my personal viewpoint of like what was fun and what was not so fun about getting a PhD. Things that were really fun about a PhD is you have a lot of independence. Like you are in charge of your own science, and that can be really fun. You can come up with brand new ideas and just run with it and see if it works. Um, scientific inquiry that goes with it. You get to learn so much. If you like learning, it is really fun. You get to just learn so much. It's so satisfying to know the nitty gritty of something. And by the end of your PhD, like you will be the expert in that little tiny thing. Like by the end of the PhD, I was the expert in the world about biased agonism of metabotropic glutamate receptors in cerebellar granule neurons. Were there like four other people studying that? Yeah, but still, I knew a lot about it, and that is really satisfying. Of course, you're a student, so you get to make friends with your other grad students. That's really fun. You can join organizations and sort of build your professional network. All of that can be really fun. And then another thing, and this is true for all research, going to conferences is also really fun. You get to learn a lot of science from different people. You potentially can travel to really fun places. When I was a graduate student, I got to go to Italy because there was this conference just about metabotropic glutamate receptors that happened every 3 years. Just so happened that it was occurring while I was a student. So I got to go to Italy with my lab. It was so fun. So that was a great, great part about my PhD. Some tough things about your PhD. It is long. By the time you end, you're just like, I've been in school forever. And that's tough. And because of that, sometimes you might feel behind your non-PhD peers. I know by the time I finished my PhD, I was looking around at my friends who had joined the workforce 5 years ago, and they felt like they were like buying houses and like nice cars. And I just felt so far behind them. And that's tough. Now, years later, I don't feel behind anymore. But at the time, it was something that I struggled with. So it's something that is tough about a PhD. It's not as structured as other educational experiences, like I mentioned. So for me, I was very used to like studying hard, getting A's. There's no A's in a PhD, so that was tough for me. And then the other thing is your research, and this is true for all research, but your experience can be so different depending on the program you're in, the department, the PI, even the project within the lab itself. Like some mentors are better than others or just a better fit for you. Some projects are going to work out and be really lucky. Some things won't. So that variability can feel tough because sometimes it can feel like, man, why didn't I get that lucky project? And that can be a challenge. And then of course, funding. As a PhD student, your funding really should be secured. Your university has essentially sort of committed to paying you throughout that PhD. That is something worth talking about and asking about in interviews, just to ask, like, is there a set amount of time that I would get funding? Similarly, when you join a lab, just making sure that they have enough funding to keep you throughout your PhD. But that is something that can be tough and can add some stress. Similarly for me, my PI ran out of money at the end of my PhD, and it was challenging because it meant that I couldn't do all the experiments that I wanted to do, and I kind of had to like MacGyver some things at the end because we didn't have the funds to buy some of the materials that I needed. Okay. Okay, so there's a question in chat and it's long. Okay, it's about PhD programs. So I'm going to answer that when we get to that stuff. Okay. PhD programs in the current climate, just to keep, since I talked about funding and I want to address this. So obviously right now, the current administration is reducing science funding by canceling some grant programs and grant funding mechanisms through the NIH and NSF, also through things like putting a cap on indirect costs, which have a really big effect on universities potentially. So right now, the extent of this impact is unclear. Things are being said. We don't really know what's actually going to happen. Hopefully, in the next year, things will become more clear and we won't be in this scary in between space. But that is kind of where we are right now. And I think because of that, this year, some universities have cut back on admissions. I think some universities have like rescinded admissions for or acceptances to PhD students because of funding. That being said, most programs are still admitting students. And I do believe that some of these issues are because of the uncertainty. And like I said, hopefully by next year, there will be more clarity. So I think by next year, maybe it might be that there will be fewer students admitted, like they just will take fewer students. But I think you won't have the situation where people are going to get their offers rescinded due to funding. So things funding wise are a little challenge or definitely challenging right now. I absolutely want to acknowledge that. But I also want to just have everyone remember that this is going to be temporary. Like we will get clarity on things. We will come through this on the other side. Science will still exist. If you definitely want to pursue a PhD, I would not let concerns about funding stop you. And you also could consider PhD programs not in the United States. I know there are international other countries who are like essentially recruiting students and scientists from the United States. So if you're open to that, this could be a fun way to live in another country. So just wanted to speak on that and also just try to remind everyone that things feel uncertain and like scary right now for sure. And those are valid feelings, but also science will still exist. It is not going to go away. So I truly believe we just have to like stay the course and not and yeah, don't let this current climate stop you from pursuing the things that you're dreaming about. Okay. So with that, how do you figure out if a PhD is a good fit for you? Now that we just kind of went through like what a PhD is, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. So some of the questions you should be asking yourself to figure out if a PhD is good for you are things like, are you comfortable with uncertainty and delayed gratification? So that uncertainty is going to come from, your experiments, your projects. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not. That delayed gratification, same thing. Science takes a long time. Also coming back to like the salary standpoint, that's another delayed gratification thing. So are you comfortable with that? Can you stay motivated working independently for long periods? So as a grad student and as an independent scientist, you're not necessarily going to have someone giving you like a checklist of things to do, which means that sometimes you might feel like it's all up to you to figure out what you're going to do next. And you're going to have to motivate yourself to keep working on those things. Do you enjoy like actually doing the research yourself? Do you like being hands-on at the bench or at the computer doing that research? Or do you more enjoy reading and talking about science? If it's more the second one, then there might be better options for you than a PhD. I'm not saying don't do a PhD at all, because maybe you do your PhD and then you pivot to a field where you're not doing that hands-on bench work. But just know that, okay, you're signing up for 5 years of doing bench work, which you maybe don't necessarily like. Similarly, do you like working at the bench? Do you want to lead your own projects, or would you rather someday support science in some other way? So through like policy or strategy. So once again, not necessarily being like a leader in that scientific space. Do you want to pursue a PhD because you actually want it? Or do you feel like you should? Are you having pressure from people telling you like, oh, you'd be so good at a PhD, you should get a PhD? And is that really coloring your opinions? Or do you actually want to get a PhD? I mentioned this because I talk to early career scientists a lot who are getting these kinds of messages. Like they've had people tell them, oh my gosh, you're so smart, you would be so great at a PhD. And because of it, they're like, I guess I should get a PhD. But then talking to them, they're like, well, I actually don't really want to do this. Everyone just keeps telling me I should. So I feel like I should. Something to consider. Just because you'd be great at it doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. And then, of course, will a PhD help me achieve the kind of career that I want? So once again, this is just the list of some of those jobs that can become available with a PhD. So how do you figure out if some of these jobs are the jobs that you want? So this is career exploration. Just a plug once again for the Career Development Office. We are here to help you with career exploration. So please come to our workshops or set up appointments to come talk to us about your career options. So you definitely should be exploring different careers for both PhDs and non-PhDs. And you should be thinking about, what do you want to do? So there's sort of like a self-awareness personality aspect here. So and I'll send these slides out so you'll get these links as well. There's two personality assessments I really like. One is called Clifton Strengths, which is paid. High Five is like a free version of that. That can be helpful just to kind of know yourself a little bit better, and that can be helpful to understand if a PhD is a good fit for you. The life values inventory is also a similar like self-assessment, just to help figure out if this is something that is aligned with your personality and your values. In addition, there are some helpful tools for career exploration. ONET, that's more of like a all career field. So it'll be asking you things about like, do you like to build cabinets? Which aren't necessarily related to science, but it's a good place to start. Another really great tool is My IDP from Science Careers. This is specifically for scientists. It is more geared towards PhD scientists. So I think at this point, it is really helpful to take that assessment and read through the careers it suggests that could be a good fit for you, for your interests, and figure out like, okay, it says I would be really interested in doing this specific career. Do I really need a PhD to do that? And then there's also this website called Intersect Job Simulations. And these are essentially like it's almost like assignments where you can practice or try out what that job actually would be. So for example, if you were interested in medical writing, it actually would take you through the whole process of like writing up a document. And you can decide like, actually, that was really fun, or I didn't like that at all. So it's a good way to explore different careers and get a better idea of like what the day-to-day and actual work of that career looks like. And then, of course, we have career seminars you can come to. We have YouTube videos on our YouTube channel. Also, there's other schools that have YouTube videos out there to just learn more about those different careers to figure out what sounds good for you. It is so important to do this career exploration before you hop into that PhD, because you want to know that you really need the PhD. If you figure out that you really want to do something and you don't need a PhD to do it, and now you're in the 4th year of your PhD and you're trying to decide, do I stay in my PhD and finish it, or should I just go to that career that I really want? Like, that's a crummy feeling that I want to avoid you having that feeling. So that's why that career exploration at the start is important. Of course, you might change your mind throughout your PhD. It's 4 to 5 years. That's a long time, right? So that definitely happens, but it's good to have your eyes like wide open as you start. And then, of course, informational interviews are super helpful for this. So this is essentially just reaching out and talking to people in your career of interest, asking them what their job is like, and of course, asking those people, do you really need a PhD for this career? If I have a PhD, does it help me advance in my career? Would it help me get that job? Things like that. So these are really important considerations when you are thinking if you want to pursue a PhD. Okay, and then just really quick, what if you decide, okay, maybe not a PhD? What are some of the alternatives? So the biggest one would be essentially work experience. So you could work full-time in a research lab as a research professional, as many of you are. You could work up to become like a lab manager or something like that, someone who has more responsibility within the lab. You could move into private sector, so you could work at biotech or pharma. Oftentimes with a master's degree and experience, you could be applicable, or you could be on the same level as a PhD, depending on the position. So for example, this is a job listing for a scientist position at a company in Boulder. And you can see that the requirements here are a master's degree and 5 years of experience or a PhD. So you could still get that job even without the PhD. So depending on the company within industry, sometimes you could use your master's and then work experience instead of a PhD. Once again, keeping in mind though, in general, if you wanted to be like at the top of that R&D department, generally that person tends to have a PhD, but there always could be exceptions. Other things you could do would be like certificate programs. So let's say you're really interested in regulatory affairs, you could get a certificate in that, certificate in project management. All of those types of things open up additional careers that go well with a science degree. Or you could look at other terminal degrees depending on what your interests are. So that would be like a doctor of public health would be an example of another terminal degree that's not a PhD, a PharmD, so you go to pharmacy school depending on what you're interested in, an MBA, especially if you're interested in more like the business side of industry. Sometimes getting that MBA can be really helpful. For example, I have a friend who has a master's in biotechnology, started working at a biotech in Boston after a couple years as a scientist. After a few years, realized he was really interested in the business side of things, so he got an MBA. And now he's vice president of a pharmaceutical company. So he has way moved up high, and he did that without a PhD. Okay, so let's say now you have decided I want a PhD. Absolutely, I'm applying. What are some of those tips here to applying? So now here's what I'm going to answer this question that's in the chat. So there's a question of, if you apply to a PhD program, knowing the questions you want to answer in your PhD, I thought you needed to match with the PI, and that really determined what you could study. Do you apply to a school thinking you will be in a certain lab, or is this something that you determine once you are accepted somewhere? In general, you apply to a program, not a lab. The reason for that is there's going to be time in between when you are applying and then when you're actually joining that lab, and things can change in that, year and a half to 2 years. Those things meaning funding. So unless it's like a super well-funded lab that like has tons and tons of money and they're definitely going to have funding for you, most PIs will probably tell you like, yes, I'm very excited. I would love to have you in my lab, but it's not a for sure thing because we need to see where funding stands in, 2 years when you're actually ready to join the lab. So usually you are not applying to a lab, you are applying to a specific program. That being said, when you're applying to that program, it's important to know which labs you would like to work for, or like which projects you are interested in. So you definitely can, and you should talk about that in your application. But that is not usually how that application process works. Usually you are applying to a program, and then once you are in that program, you will select a lab. And then, do you apply to a certain school thinking you will be in a certain lab? So I would not apply to a school thinking you will be in a specific lab. You certainly can hope you will be in that specific lab, but I wouldn't put all of your eggs in that basket unless you already have a relationship with that PI, like you know them, or you've already talked to them and they have made it very clear that they will have funding for you in 2 years. What if you get into a lab and that it isn't a great fit? Are you done? No, so it is possible. That's first off, that's the point of rotations, right? Is you have a chance to try out all those labs. That's another good reason why people don't just like apply to a lab and get admitted to a lab, because you're going to try it out first. That's what the rotations are for. That being said, sometimes you'll do a rotation, think it's a good fit, start working in that lab, work there for a couple years and realize this is not a good fit, or other things could happen like funding gets cut, things like that. In those cases, I would say this is not common, but you definitely can move labs. In general, the departments are accommodating of this. So they want to support you if something happens. It is something that could potentially prolong your timeline and make things a little bit harder, but it doesn't mean that you have to like quit the program. It doesn't mean that you have to just tough it out. Like there are alternatives if you end up picking a lab and it's not the best fit. So it's not 100% set in stone. But that being said, that is why the rotations are so important. Okay. So PhD programs, you're deciding to apply. You've got tons of options. At CU Anschutz, there's lots and lots of programs. There is one program, and this is true at many universities, that's an umbrella program. Here it's called BSP, the Biomedical Sciences program. It's essentially like coming in uncommitted. Like you want to do a PhD, but you haven't quite figured out which topic. Usually they want you to be deciding between two things. So maybe for me, I actually was admitted to the BSB program and I was trying to decide between pharmacology or structural biology and biochemistry. I also separately applied to both of those programs at the same time. And I just like wasn't sure which one I was more interested in. So it is a nice option if you're like, oh man, I just can't decide between like, I really want to do cancer biology, but I also am really interested in immunology. Like that could be an option for you to apply to those umbrella programs. They do tend to be more competitive than applying directly to the program itself. How competitive is it to be accepted? So in terms of like the number of, so this is going to depend greatly year to year, like the number of spots, the number of applicants, things like that. Oh man, I should have looked up these numbers. I want to say it's something like 10% or something like that of people who apply get offers. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I will look up the numbers, and then when I send you guys the slides and the recording of this afterwards, I will let you know like the specific numbers from the past couple years. But like I said, that is variable. So I think probably this year and next year, those numbers might be a little more competitive just because of like the uncertainty in funding. Okay, so how do you pick a program? What about non-traditional applicants? Can you expand upon what you mean by non-traditional? So just older age. No, it's not necessarily harder. Um, I will talk a little bit about like what they're looking for when they are looking at applications. So how do you pick a program? One of the big things to consider is the type of university you want to do your PhD at. So how much federal funding do they receive? Are they what's called an R1? CU Anschutz is an R1. That means that most of their faculty are doing 100% research or like 90% research and 10% teaching. So it is a research university. That's different than like an R2. An R2 usually gets less federal funding, so they have less research dollars. Their teachers or their faculty are doing more teaching. That means if you're at an R2, you probably might TA in addition to doing research. Another good question is, do you want to TA? Do you want to gain that teaching experience? For example, here at CU Anschutz, there really are very few, almost no opportunities to TA. So if you like teaching and you want to have that experience, you don't get that at CU Anschutz. But if you don't want to TA, you don't have to. So pros and cons, that is up to you and what you want. Other things to consider, like research opportunities within the department. So that's looking at different faculty, their labs, their focuses. What are you interested in doing? Of course, that's important to think about. So for example, in pharmacology is a pretty broad discipline. I would say in general, there's like three buckets. There's like neuropharmacology, neuroscience, cardiopharmacology, so like lots of things with cardiovascular disease, and then cancer. So depending on what you want to think about the programs you're applying to, what do they focus on? So I was really interested in neuroscience, so I picked a program that was more neuroscience heavy. Our program had like almost no cancer pharmacology within our specific pharmacology program. So if that's what you were interested in, my program would not have been a good fit for you. Of course, the university itself, their support, like do they have a career development office? Do they have like different clubs and organizations that you would be interested in joining just to help support your like social needs and also your career goals? What are the benefits? So some universities might provide additional benefits in addition to like health insurance. If you have children or you're thinking about starting a family, looking into like, are there parental leave and things like that? Those are worth looking into. Work-life balance is something to consider. I would say it could be variable from department to department, how much they expect PhD students to work. And then of course, location. Location is a huge thing to think about. So this could be like, do you want to live close to your family or friends? That was a big consideration for me. Like I said, my partner moved to DC, so I wanted to be close to him. So I moved to DC. Another thing to think about are career opportunities. So for example, if you are like, I absolutely want to work at a really prestigious biotech or pharmaceutical company, it might make sense for you to go to a place like California or Massachusetts or North Carolina, where there are a lot of those companies. There are certainly some of those companies in Colorado, but you can see we're not as concentrated in those companies as some of those other markets. So things to think about. Also like hobbies. Maybe I know a lot of people come to Colorado because they love skiing and the outdoors and rock climbing. So those are important things too. You have to live in this place for 4 to 6 years. So think about the location. And then of course, cost of living, because some of these places like California and Massachusetts that have lots of these companies are also very expensive. So is it worth the trade-off there to gain that experience and be in that market, but also knowing you're going to be in a higher cost of living location? So those are all the things you want to consider when you are thinking about programs and schools to apply to. Okay, so and I'm sorry, I know we're going over time. If you guys have to leave, you can leave, but I'm going to keep talking and I'll send out the video afterwards. I'm so sorry. So sorry, there's a question in the chat. What tips can you provide on finding an advisor and on maintaining a productive and supportive relationship throughout the program? What were habits that supported you being successful in school and life while in your program? Okay, I'm going to wait on both of those questions because those are more questions that are like after you've applied, like now you are a PhD student. So I'm going to answer those after we talk about the PhD program admission process. Okay, so what does it look like to actually apply to a PhD program and get admitted? So of course you have to apply. So you have an application. I'll talk more about that. Then if you get selected for interviews, you will interview for the program. Usually those interviews are on campus, so they actually will pay for you to go to that university. Usually it'll be a cohort, so it'll be a whole group of people you are interviewing with, so like maybe 10 people. And then within that interview, you'll meet with like current students. Usually you'll also meet individually with like 4 to 6 professors and talk to them about their research. You will talk to them about your research history as well. So it's kind of like you have a lot of mini interviews with a number of faculty members. Oftentimes, if you get interviews, they will ask you if there's any specific professors you want to meet with. So this is a good time if you're considering specific labs to join to talk about those specific professors so that you can start talking to them and express your interest in joining their labs. If interviews go well, then, I should mention, usually interviews are often like a full day. Sometimes they're 2 days. So this is like a pretty time intensive thing. So good to plan. Usually these are happening in like February or March. So just good to know if you are applying to PhD programs to communicate with like your boss and things like that, that, hey, I might have to take some time off to go to some of these interviews in the spring. And then if interviews go well, then you will get an offer. And then if you accept that offer, you'd be admitted to the program. Like I mentioned before, generally you are admitted to a program, not a specific lab within that program. So you would be admitted to the pharmacology program, not to the Robluski lab, which is the lab I did my PhD in. And then, like I said, within the first year of your PhD, you were doing those rotations, and then you're thinking about how to select a good PhD lab. So how do you do that? This comes back to the question that Lauren asked here in the comments. So how do you find a good lab, and how do you think about which lab you should pick? There's multiple considerations here. There is sort of your working style and your mentor's mentorship style. So it's good to kind of do some of that self-awareness about how do you work, how do you like to be managed, and be able to just make some of that clear and talk about that with your mentor. For example, some mentors are going to be like very hands-on. They're going to want to check in with you all the time. Maybe they're in the lab even like doing experiments, whereas other mentors might be like very hands-off. They might expect you to come to them with questions, and if you don't, they might not really check in very frequently. So that depends on you and what works well for you. So you need to have self-awareness of that. And then you need to make sure you are talking about those needs with that potential mentor, and also asking more senior PhD students what their experiences were like so that you can figure out who you are going to mesh well with. And then, of course, there's the project itself and like the techniques you are learning. If you want to be within a specific field, that's obviously going to be important. So let's say you really want to do research in multiple sclerosis. So you want to pick like an MS related lab. I would hope that your department might have more than one option for you, so that you don't have to like pigeonhole yourself and like, well, I have to pick this lab because this is the only thing I'm interested in, even if that mentor is not a good fit. If possible, I would say try to avoid that situation so that you can do more than one rotation and you can try to make sure you are like a good fit with that mentor. So then tips on maintaining a productive relationship with your mentor, honestly, communication is the biggest one. You should hopefully be having like regular meetings with your mentor. If they don't set that up, you should set that up so that you are meeting like, I would say once a week, maybe once every other week, just to check in. Here's what I did last week. Here's what I'm planning to do. Here are the challenges I'm having. Those frequent touch points are really important. Even if it's like via email or something, just to make sure you have those frequent lines of communication. And then that's also really helpful because the more you talk with your mentor, the easier it is going to be to come to them when you have problems, when you have challenges. Maybe you're just like, I feel like this isn't working. I want to try something else. Like that's kind of a hard conversation. It's going to be easier if you're used to talking to your mentor really frequently. In addition, good habits to have Don't only rely on your PI to be your only mentor. So look for other faculty to help you out and to give you guidance. That could be your committee or committee members. For example, it could also be like senior PhD students in your own lab or postdocs in your own lab. So don't only rely on your PI, really make like a network of people who can mentor you and give you advice. And then in terms of like habits, definitely be aware of work-life balance. Don't overwork yourself. It's really easy to do that because there will always be more work you can do. And so it can be hard to prioritize time for yourself, and to feel like you are allowed to like step away from the lab. So try to give yourself grace and tell yourself like it's okay to not work on a weekend. That is okay. That is good. And then other habits is just making sure you have some way to stay organized, and like keep on top of all your different projects, keep on top of, especially when you start writing, to just make sure you're working a little bit on that every day and staying organized and keeping yourself accountable. Those are all things that, some tips, quickly, many tips. How many applications do you recommend we do? I recommend you apply to the schools that are a good fit for you. So if you feel like there's 10 schools that are a great fit, apply to all 10. If you feel like there's only 2 schools that are a good fit to you, only apply to 2. Don't apply to schools you don't actually want to go to. That would be my advice. It is unlikely you really want to go to 50 schools. So you shouldn't be submitting that many applications, because it's just, make sure you're looking into those departments, understanding the research, understanding that location, and really deciding if that's a good fit. I would say it's going to be different than like medical school, where maybe you are applying to tons and tons and tons, because it's like a relationship you're entering into with that PI. It is, and that university, the fit is really important for a PhD. Okay. So, what does the application look like for a PhD program? I would say it's general by school, but in general, some of the things to expect: your transcripts, full transcripts from undergrad, and your master's if you have one. That would include your coursework and your GPA. Sometimes they will ask you for your overall GPA and your science specific GPA. The rule of thumb is generally you want your GPA to be at least above a 3.0. That's in general. If you are an international student, some sort of English language proficiency exam like the TOEFL or something like that will be required as well. You'll need to turn in a CV or a resume. If you need help crafting those documents, come to the Career Development Office. That's what we're here for. Letters of recommendation, usually it's 3, but it's variable among schools. GRE, not at all schools. CU Anschutz doesn't accept the GRE, but some schools still do. So as you're making that list, looking if they require the GRE, and if they do, you need to take that. Some schools might also require like the subject specific GRE, so also look into that. Although I would say the GRE is falling out of favor, so fewer schools are requiring that. And then there always will be some sort of written statement. Some schools might require a personal statement and a research statement. Some schools, they might be combined together into one statement. I will talk a little bit about what both of those things look like. And then, of course, you have to pay a fee, although waivers are usually available for those fees. So definitely reach out to the schools to see if you can get those fees waived, if that is something that is a hindrance. Okay, so as you are thinking about your application, what are the programs actually looking for? So the biggest thing that they're looking for when they're evaluating your application is if you are prepared for rigorous graduate classes and if you're prepared for research. So yes, the classes are only 1 to 2 years, but they want to make sure you're ready to hit the ground running. So because of that, your previous coursework does matter a little bit. Like if you got your undergrad degree in, let's say, psychology, but you haven't really taken like chemistry, biochemistry, organic chemistry, molecular biology, anything like that, it's going to be harder for you to get into like an immunology PhD program, just because they're going to worry that you will have a knowledge gap when you start those classes. So if that's the case for you, you might want to consider taking some classes now, like you could take them through your tuition credit if you're a research services professional, so that you can just take some of those background classes to make it clear that you're ready for those rigorous graduate classes. And then prepared for research. That means that you understand, one, what research looks like. You understand that research is uncertain, that it is oftentimes, you have to be like a self-starter, you have to be independent, that you know what that is going to be like. and that you are prepared for that challenge. Of course, they want to see a strong academic history, so strong coursework, good grades. If you have previous research experience, that's tremendously helpful because obviously it speaks to being prepared to research, to do research. They also wanted to see that you have interests that align with the program. So you can do that through customizing your personal statement and research statement to make it clear that you are specifically interested in the type of research that they do at their program. And then you want to make it clear that you have passion and curiosity, because that is why you are getting a PhD. I wouldn't in your personal statement say like, I want to make more money than I would with a master's degree. Like that's not what they're looking for. They want to hear that you're really excited about asking questions and answering those questions. You want to make that clear in your applications. And then of course, strong written communication skills. You have to write a dissertation at the end, which I said is over 100 pages long. There's a lot of writing that you have to do. So you do need to have strong written communication skills. Please, please do not use ChatGPT to write anything for your graduate school applications. You can tell when you're reading a lot of personal statements or something like that. You absolutely can tell which ones have been written by ChatGPT. And that is something I would say is pretty much disqualifying. Like faculty really don't like seeing that. It means that you couldn't take the time to write your own personal statement. If you wrote something and you asked ChatGPT to like edit it for grammar, that's fine. But ChatGPT should not be writing any words for you. It should be your own wording in all of these written things. That's so important. It is not worth risking it and getting your application thrown out because it's like, oh, this person obviously used ChatGPT. So. Okay. What do you do if you write something entirely on your own, but it gets mistaken for being AI generated? I don't think that will happen because AI does tend to have like a very specific voice. So if you are speaking in your own voice, I think that will come across, especially if it is consistent among all of your documents, among like your personal statement and your research statement, it's going to look consistent. So the biggest thing is just, I would say like, don't use ChatGPT to write things for you. If you want to use it to give you feedback on like grammar or feedback on how to make it better, those are great, but definitely don't have it write it for you because that is, you're risking things there. So, okay, do you need to do a master's before a PhD? Just so you know, no, you don't have to do a master's first. That being said, a master's can help you be more competitive, especially if you're looking to gain research experience, if you have specific coursework that you need to bulk up, like my example of you got your undergrad in psychology and now you want to get a PhD in immunology, it would make sense to get a master's in immunology first because now you have all that coursework. Similarly, if your undergrad GPA is maybe not quite where you want it to be, a master's can help show like growth that you have turned things around and now you're ready to be that rigorous PhD student. A master's degree can also be a good way to kind of try out some research before committing to a PhD, although keep in mind you have to pay for a master's degree. So you are going to potentially take on some debt to do that. I would say if you want to try out research before committing to a PhD, I would suggest you work instead. So get a job as a research services professional or as a PRA or something like that and work full time instead of getting a master's degree. For example, if you are doing that now at Steve Anschutz, you can actually take classes for free through the tuition benefit as you are doing that. So you can take some classes, you can gain research experience, and you don't have to pay for that additional degree. It's also good to keep in mind that sometimes that master's coursework might not actually transfer to a PhD program. So for example, in my PhD program, if you got a master's in our same department, so a master's in pharmacology, all of those classes did transfer. They were like the exact same classes. So someone could get a master's and they get admitted to the PhD program and they essentially would start as a second-year PhD student. But if someone had gotten a master's degree in pharmacology from a different school, they would probably only get like electives transferred and they would still have to take a lot of the PhD or a lot of the coursework over again. So a master's degree like could save you some time, but it might not necessarily. So just good things to keep in mind if you're trying to decide if you want to do a master's and then do a PhD. There's definitely pros and cons to that path. Okay. So I mentioned there were two writing parts of the application, the personal statement and the research statement. And like I said, some schools will have you do these together in one big statement. But in general, what this means is a personal statement is more like, it's kind of like a personal essay, like when you applied to college, sort of like your college essay. So this is going to help the admissions committee understand who you are and where you're going. So you want to talk about your past experience that have prepared you for graduate research. So that can talk about your research history, but it can also talk about like other work experience, your like coursework you've taken, just things that have made it clear that you are ready for what research is like. You understand what it's like. This is also the place to explain why you want a PhD and specifically why you want a PhD in that field. So for example, for me, I talked about how I really enjoy learning about cells, and I had like a whole story about an experience I had where I learned about something and then I figured out, or I used that knowledge to like figure out how to design a specific drug, and how that was so fascinating and like a pivotal moment in my career trajectory, and how I wanted to continue learning and discovering to do drug development. So that's a place where you kind of talk about your motivations and your passions. Your personal statement would also be a place to talk about any challenges you have overcome. So this is a place to talk about if you're like a first generation student, this is a good place to talk about that. If you had any challenges in undergrad, maybe that might have caused like a gap in your schooling, this is a good place to talk about that just so that you can address it so people understand what it is, things like that. Your personal statement is generally something you should probably tailor a little bit for each program in each school and make sure it's aligned with what type of research they're doing in that program. And of course, it should be well written, professional, written in your own voice, written in your own words. And then your research statement. So the research statement is literally just about research. So it's your research experience and then also your research goals. So here you're going to talk about your past research projects. As you were talking about your research, anytime, I always like to remind you to think about the 4 pillars of excellent science communication, which is you always want to talk about what is the problem? Why does that problem matter? What is the solution? And then what is the benefit? So as you're talking about your research, you want to make sure you hit all of those things. Of course, keeping in mind that depending on the extent of your research, your solution or your problem might be small. That's fine. It's still important to just be able to effectively communicate what you did and why it mattered. And then, of course, you want to connect your past experience to your future goals and make it clear how that aligns well with the program. This is a good place where you can highlight specific labs that you could potentially want to work with. And then, of course, if you have any accomplishments, like you've presented at a conference or you've given a talk or you've won any honors for your research, this is a good place to include that as well. And then, of course, professionally written, this is a research statement, so you can have some scientific terminology in there, but avoid tons of jargon. Keep it accessible to everyone. Okay, so some general tips. So moving on to letters of recommendation. So letters of recommendation are really important for graduate school. And so some tips for who you should ask. In general, the faculty want to hear from their peers. So they want to hear from like other faculty members or people who are like at a similar place in their career. So more senior management level people. So good people to ask would be your professors from previous courses. If you have done any research, PIs from those labs. So undergrad research, if you're a research professional now, the PI of your current lab. Or if you don't have a lot of research experience, you can also ask supervisors from non-research jobs. I would just make sure to make it clear when you ask them that you want them to speak to like your work ethic, your time management, things like that, things that would be transferable to research. If you worked as a hostess for 3 years, I wouldn't be like, hey, talk about how great I am at hostess scene. No, instead talk about like how good I am at working under pressure and time management and, being there for the team or something like that. People you should not ask. Don't ask families or friends. In general, don't ask people who don't know you very well, or people down here who are like very prestigious but won't give you a great recommendation. These are for the same reason. So if you like took a class once with a Nobel laureate, but that person does not know you at all, like, yeah, cool, Nobel laureate, but they can't actually speak very well to you. So that letter is not going to be very strong. So the weakness of the letter will overshadow like the prestige of the person writing it. So you really want the people writing the letters to write glowing letters for you. And then also try not to ask TAs. I would say very rarely, there might be exceptions to this. If you did some sort of research and like that TA could really speak to it and the professor wasn't really involved, maybe, but I would avoid asking TAs or like postdocs or something like that. You really want to ask like the leader of that group to write you that letter. And then other tips for writing letters, ask well in advance, at least 2 weeks. As someone who has written over 100 recommendation letters, a month is better. It especially because all those requests come at the same time, and it takes a while to write a good letter, and you want to write a great letter that really is deserving of that person. So at least 2 weeks is really, really helpful. And then also provide some guidance to help your letter writers. So that would be like give them your CV and resume, give them your transcripts, let them know very clearly which programs you're applying to and why. Also, super clear what dates they need to get the letters in by. If you've already written your personal statement or research statement, give those as well. That's helpful because then they can make sure they're kind of like backing up some of the things that you said about yourself. Alternatively, or in addition, you can also give like an outline of some key points. So for example, if you might say, I am really talking about my ability to overcome adversity. Like in undergrad, I had some like medical issues I had to overcome, and it was really tough. I had to take a break, but then I, came back. I asked for help. I advocated for myself, and then I like persevered and I finished strong. And that's kind of the story I'm telling about myself, that I have tenacity. And I'd love if you could also outline where I've done that within my job, like so that you guys are kind of telling the same story. Those are all great things to do. In general, I would say I don't. Some people will tell you to do this, to just like write the letter for them. For me, that feels gross. Um, I would never, if someone gave me a pre-written letter, I would rewrite it. I would not accept it personally. So I would not write the letter for them, but it is totally okay to kind of give them some talking points of like, these are the things I am saying about myself. And it would be helpful if you feel comfortable, if you could reinforce those same key points. Okay, so with that, just some closing thoughts on if a PhD is right for you and how to get into a PhD program. The biggest thing is just really be thoughtful about your decision to pursue a PhD. Is it really the right fit for you? Um, I know there's a lot of external factors sometimes, like people telling you you should do this, or even like the prestige of like, ooh, being called doctor, that sounds cool. But is it really the right fit for you? To answer that question, you really have to do some self-exploration. So you need to look into careers that excite you and figure out if a PhD is going to help you excel in those roles. So, and then finally, you don't have to figure it all out today. This is a process. I definitely would take the time to explore those careers, do informational interviews, talk to other people, really think about if you could see yourself as a PhD student, and if that excites you, or if it feels like something where you're like, oh gosh, I guess I could make it through those 5 years, but I just want to get to the other side and then move on to that next step. If that's how you feel, then maybe think about that next step and figure out, can you get there without having to do the PhD? For example, could you do a master's and then work for 5 years in industry instead of doing the PhD, if that's how doing a PhD maybe makes you feel? So just consider or continue to reflect and think about it. And of course, we are here for advice. Other people you should reach out to, your mentors, your peers, people at CU Anschutz, talk to other graduate students. I would say try to talk to a wide range of graduate students, because some people would be like, this is the best thing ever. And then other people will be like, I hate this. So you want a diversity of opinions. Don't leave it all to like the one PhD student who gripes a lot. Like talk to a number of people, because you will get a wide variety of opinions about it. Okay. So, and with that, I went way over time. I am so sorry. If you have questions, you can unmute yourself, or you can continue to ask them in the chat, or you can always email me, set up an appointment on Handshake, and we could talk more. But yeah. So I'll stick around for a little bit in case anyone has any questions. Thank you. Thank you. All right. It looks like that's it. So thank you all for joining us. And once again, if you have any questions, please reach out. We are happy to help.